Good morning to all of the people in the East Coast of America and going westward and elsewhere in the world, and good afternoon to many of the people across the pond in the UK where I am and elsewhere in the world. We are currently at a CES Insights webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce on climate action and global cooperation, a conversation with Bill McKibben. Now, this is part of a webinar series that began last spring from the Council for European Studies. It gives people who are participating a taster of what we in the CES do. We are interested in European studies from a broad interdisciplinary perspective, including political science, history, literature, anthropology, geography, and on and on. And in this particular topic, we see how these different fields merge together in this discussion. If you're interested in any of the Insight series, please do check out the CES YouTube channel where these have been recorded from previous discussions, and please do take a look at our webpage to keep abreast of any further webinars that will be coming up. Now, today's topic is an exciting venture for us as an organization. We have a growing interest in environment and in climate change and these sorts of issues. And we also have a growing interest in possibly starting a new research network in this area. So if you do have any interest in pursuing this, please do feel free to participate in the CES at any of our upcoming events, including our annual conferences. Keep an eye out for that upcoming research network, and do, as ever, keep an eye out for further webinar topics. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Milena Buchs, who will be chairing today's discussion. Milena is an associate professor at the University of Leeds who's interested in sustainability, and she will be very ably handling this exciting discussion today with Bill McKibben and Dominic Boyer. Thank you. Oh, before Milena takes over, sorry, I've forgotten two important housekeeping tidbits. One is if you do have questions during today's discussion, do use the Q&A box below. So if you wave your cursor, you'll see at the very bottom of the screen, it says Q&A, and you can type into that like a chat box and you can ask your question there. And then we will see it and be able to answer it. And two, we are recording this. So if you do want to refer to it in the future, you will be sent a link as a participant, but it will also be available on the CES's YouTube channel. So you can look at that in the future as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julia. And hello to everyone and welcome to this session. Many thanks to Julia, the CES, and Laura for organizing this very exciting event, at which we will be discussing basically strategies to tackle climate change, and especially international cooperation, but also a range of other topics. And I think this is really a very important topic at the moment, partly and also and not unimportantly, because things have really changed in the US, and hopefully Bill and Dominic will be able to talk about that a little bit more from the US perspective. So we have quite a mixed audience, I hope, and I'm sure it will be really interesting for sort of both sides to really explore what's going on. So like I said, we will be touching on a range of different topics. International cooperation is just one, but we will also be talking about the role of grassroots organizations, what citizens can do in putting pressure on governments to achieve more radical climate change action. And I will be introducing Bill and Dominic in a moment, but also just to highlight again before I do this, so the plan for today is that we have an interview between Dominic and Bill. So Dominic will be asking Bill a couple of questions roundabout for sort of maybe 30-35 minutes. We can see how the conversation flows, and then you feel free and actually please put some questions already during that discussion into the Q&A box. We will be picking up these questions once we open up the discussion. So I probably don't really need to introduce Bill to you, because Bill is very well known as the founder of the grassroots organization 350.org, which campaigns for radical and rapid decarbonization of the economy, also with an emphasis on justice and fairness, which is also really, really important for this whole debate. Bill is a contributing writer to The New Yorker, and he is the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. He has, of course, published widely on environmental issues, published over a dozen of books. And if all of this wasn't enough, he also received the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize in 2014, as well as the Gandhi Peace Award. So we are honored to have you with us, Bill. Many thanks for joining us. Dominique Boyer is going to interview Bill, like I said. Dominic is a professor in anthropology at Rice University, where he also set up and directed the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in Human Sciences. Dominic is, as an anthropologist, currently doing research with flood victims in Houston, Texas, so a very topical area of research, of course, and also on electric futures across the world, on which he has published widely too. Dominic has also contributed to the production of a documentary film called Not Okay, which is about Iceland's first major glacier lost to climate change. And I believe one of his questions to Bill will be about the role of arts in climate action. So a very warm welcome to you to Dominic. And I'm now going to hand over to the two of you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Milena. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, CES, for organizing this event. And thank you, Bill. It's a great honor to talk to you.
Real pleasure.
Long inspired by your work. So let's just jump into it and let's talk about what's happening today. I mean, this is Groundhog's Day, which is a curious little American holiday that we might have to explain to our European colleagues. But the gist of it is that a large rodent pokes his head out of the ground after a long winter and decides whether spring is coming. So we've just had 4 years of climate denialism, on steroids that felt like 40 years to some of us. And how are you feeling a couple of weeks into the new administration here?
Well, that's actually a good analogy because on the one hand, spring is coming in terms of climate policy and things in the United States. I would wager that overt climate denialism got on the plane with Trump to Florida and won't be heard from again in that form. And we've already seen real indications of a different kind of commitment than any previous administration to doing something about climate change. So spring is coming. Also, summer is coming, and a summer like we've never seen before. Our problem is that climate change, unlike all the other political challenges that humans face and have faced, is very much a timed test. And so one measures progress not in comparison with how much one did in the past or so on. One measures progress against the bar set by physics and chemistry, which is an extremely high bar that really no one is close to meeting at this point.
But maybe one of the ways we can work forward or sort of work on this issue is through cooperation. And so I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit, especially on the history of US-European cooperation. That's been central to the mission of CES for a long time, is fostering transatlantic exchanges and dialogues. How are you thinking about the sort of the new US-Europe relationship in terms of creating the kinds of capacity, intellectual and political, to meet this time test?
Well, let's think about cooperation for a little while outside the realm of governments. Really, the story of climate change has been a story for decades of governmental failure on pretty much every count to take action at a level at all commensurate with the science around us, and of governments all too often hobbled by their fossil fuel industries. You're in Houston, so you have a sense of the political power of the Exxons of the world. For a long time, the same has been true of BP and Shell and Total and the other players in the European industry. Counterbalancing that has been a growing, ever growing movement of citizens to demand action. And it happened around the world, but its centers, two of its centers have been in Europe and the United States. And the most recent kind of iteration of this work that's been, really, really, really important has been the work that Greta Thunberg and many, many other young people kicked off 2 years or so ago, 2.5 years ago, that has, well, literally rejuvenated this global climate movement and continued to make it a real force. It existed before then and really was the reason, or one of the reasons, that the Paris climate talks were, to the degree that they were successful. And I think that contribution can't be understated. The reason that the Copenhagen climate talks failed in 2009 was largely the fact that political leaders in most countries faced no real domestic pressure to bring home results. And by the time we got to Paris, that had decisively shifted and failure was no longer an option in the same way. So I think that's really where the intellectual cooperation began. And with that goad, governments have begun to move into action. And we see examples of this all over the place. European governments are, to some degree, ahead of the US on this, especially because the US has spent the last 4 years in this Trumpian swamp. But nobody is far enough ahead that they can look back with any satisfaction. Although I will say that the one of the emerging exceptions, I was very glad to see in the news today that the Irish government was moving to ban all oil and gas exploration. The Irish really seem to be taking on this on as many fronts as they can figure out how to do it. So good for them. And there's a lot of other good work going on across Europe that we can talk about, but it's always, in every case, motivated by continuing movements of citizens. In the Irish case, it was remarkable work by Trocare, the Catholic charity in Ireland. But in much of the rest of the country, in much of the rest of Europe, it's been Fridays for the Future, the sort of descendants of Thunberg's activism. It's been Extinction Rebellion, and it's been the very widespread, and since we're talking to a largely academic audience here, the very widespread divestment movement from fossil fuel that's helped push hard on this. And many, many of the institutions I'm sure that people are joining us from today have already divested or have active campaigns underway. And these have been instrumental in undermining the political power of the fossil fuel industry, and hence making it more possible for governments to do something constructive.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bill. And of course, in a place like Houston, you sense the immense political power of the fossil fuel industry every day. I like to call it Mordor. And if we didn't learn anything else from the Lord of the Rings, that real reform has to start in Mordor. So even in the heart of the fossil fuel industry, you got to keep the environmental pressure going. But I also wanted to ask you about path dependency, because even in countries like Germany, which don't have much in the way of fossil fuel ambitions themselves, but an enormous automotive industry, all sorts of other ways in which the privileges and luxuries of the global north and that lifestyle, which is very energy intensive and has relied on fossil fuels for decades, make it hard to change. So to what extent do you see the kind of direct pressure of the fossil fuel industry being the problem, and just kind of the, as you put it, in your book, Falter, privilege lies in obliviousness, the sort of convenient obliviousness of living in a well-to-do sort of high energy lifestyle and not really having to think too much about the environmental concerns?
Well, there's definitely a lot of that. One of the interesting things that's happened over the last decade is that the engineers have done such a spectacular job in lowering the price of solar and wind energy to the point where it's now the cheapest form of energy that there is, that it changes somewhat the calculations about how we proceed. And it seems more possible to imagine, and I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, as some of each, but it seems more possible to imagine supporting something that looks like a European lifestyle on renewable energy than it did a decade ago. And Germany is a good example of this, moving steadily and fitfully toward far more renewable-based economy. Its utilities essentially bankrupted by that shift, masked in some ways by Germany's decision to get rid of nuclear power too along the way, but clearly going aggressively in that direction, as is the UK. As is, a number of other, Spain being a preeminent example of rapid movement in this direction. So that, the fossil fuel industry's power is being undercut from two directions. There's this big movement trying to hold it account for destroying the planet and lying about it in the process. And there's this competitive industry emerging that's producing the same product just at a better price and much more cleanly. And so the question at this point is not whether, we move towards a renewable economy. We will, because sun and wind are free, and eventually that will, tell the tale. The question is how quickly we move there. 75 years from now, the world will run on sun and wind. But if it takes us 75 or even 25 years to get there, then the world that runs on sun and wind will be a broken world. So this sort of battle about pace is all about how quickly, how long the fossil fuel industry can hold on to how much of its business model. And there are signs of some capitulation. BP last year was made the first really serious commitment by an oil major to, we don't know how, whether they're going to do it or not, but at least the commitment is on paper interesting, to cut oil and gas production 40% this decade and invest very, very heavily in renewable energy. That could and should become a template, just as the template of the automakers, first in Germany and as of last week, General Motors in Detroit, to move to entirely electric fleets. Not happening fast enough, and we don't want as car-dependent societies as we have at any rate, but a clear indication of where we're headed now. And so the question becomes, I think, less about direction than pace.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you've mentioned some of the developments or some of the dynamics that are certainly setting us up for the possibility of rapidly accelerating this transition, which I think, everyone who cares about the environment, who cares about the planet, is committed to that. You mentioned divestment campaigns as one sort of kind of important policy or just movement goal. We could talk about institutional investment funds that are beginning to divest their holdings from fossil fuels. Recently, we've seen some announcements about phasing out of internal combustion engines, notably by GM. Are there other kinds of actions that you think would be particularly helpful right now to sort of pressure this change forward? Are there things that maybe we're not as aware of as average citizens here that you think could actually be areas in which we should be investing our political energy?
The divestment movement has morphed and expanded in the last couple of years into really full-on attacks on the banks, asset managers, and insurance companies that provide the kind of money pipeline to the fossil fuel industry. And I think that's proving to be very fruitful work. It's a lot of it going on in Europe, especially in Europe, a lot of work on central banks and public banking. And the French central bank announced last week that it would be soon out of the business of fossil fuel finance. And hopefully the European Central Bank will continue to make this a priority. The Biden administration has already announced that the Export-Import Bank in the U.S. and that the U.S. Vote on the World Bank and the IMF will, be against new fossil fuel money. Really important, public and also private. So the campaigns against HSBC, against Barclays, and in this country, JP Morgan Chase, BlackRock, Citi, Wells Fargo, all of these are very big pressure points. The fossil fuel industry is greatly weakened without that kind of easy cash flow. And so far, there's been real progress on those fronts. Even a few years of movement pressure has begun to get real changes from those players. There's also the ongoing fight against new fossil fuel infrastructure of any kind. So, for instance, all the fights about pipelines. We just won in the US the endless 10-year battle against the Keystone XL pipeline that was kind of the progenitor of an awful lot of this work. But there are a lot of other battles going on in the US and around the world. And some of them are just, one of the ones around the world that just strikes me as the most crazy example of sort of every dumb thing you can think of is this is the project largely supported by Total and the French for this East Africa crude oil pipeline, a project of the of sort of deep colonial imprint, even if it wasn't freighted to carry a lot of oil that we can't afford to burn for climate change reasons. It would be destructive in many, many other ways. And it's a sort of perfect example of these kind of zombie hangover projects from an earlier time that we wouldn't propose now, I don't think, but that are extremely hard to kill off, but need to be killed off, because if we don't, then they'll be sitting there for 40 or 50 or 60 years, prolonging the fossil fuel era way past the point where anyone thinks we should be doing this stuff.
Yeah, and zombies, as we know from the movies, are hard to kill. They smugly feel as though they should have a right to live infinitely. So, even though they produce, sort of present a clear and present danger to the rest of us. So, point well taken. I wanted to just switch gears on cooperation a little bit and think about, the other big crisis that we're facing, the health crisis, the pandemic crisis. And the reason I wanted to ask about it is I think one of the fears we have about climate change is that as the situation gets worse, as environments deteriorate, as storms and droughts and floods become more frequent, that there will be a tendency for countries to retract into themselves and pursue very nationalist or localist policies as a result. And I think the pandemic has been an interesting case in which you could probably find some real bright spots of true cooperation, and also some countries that have tried to really go it on their own. And so I wanted to ask, what you may have learned, or you and your colleagues may have learned from this pandemic experience that might apply to how we take the climate movement forward.
Well, I think that there are sort of important lessons both within countries and between them. I mean, if you ask the basic lessons that COVID should have taught us, one is it's a potent reminder that physical reality is indeed real. I've been making the case for decades that you can't force chemistry and physics to negotiate or compromise. And the COVID molecule as a microbe is a reminder that biology is the same. It doesn't matter if the president announces that it's all going to go away. The microbe's in charge here. And if it says stand 6 feet apart and wear a mask, then do it. And the second sort of lesson that it reminds us is that when dealing with physical reality, sometimes, and this echoes a point I've been making already, speed really matters. if you wanted to flatten the COVID curve, you actually had to get to work right away. And so South Korea did, and the US didn't. And so now one of them is a large pile of dead bodies and a wrecked economy. Um, you know, we wasted February and March in COVID. We wasted the last 30 years on climate. It means we now have to move extraordinarily fast to have any hope of catching up. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that we have to fundamentally transform our energy systems, which they helpfully defined as cutting emissions in half by 2030 to have a hope of meeting the targets we set in Paris just 5 or 6 years ago. That's a very, very, that's on the bleeding edge of the technically possible. But that's what happens when you ignore things for a long time. Those of us who issued warnings 30 years ago have to occasionally remind ourselves that it's impolite to say, oh, if only you'd listen to me when. Third thing, most important, is that solidarity actually really matters. In the US and in the UK, and to some extent in other places, we've lived the last 40 years in the political shadow of Reagan and Thatcher, and of the idea that that markets solved all problems, that the most important thing humans could do was each try to get individually wealthier, that Ronald Reagan's famous laugh line in his speeches was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Turns out that the scariest words in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is now on fire. Neither of which yield to market forces. They require the solidarity between human beings that we call governments to make things, have any chance of getting through. And I think that, both COVID and climate illustrate this at the deepest level on a global basis, that we're in desperate need of some kind of effective solidarity. You can't solve, at the moment, what we're doing is, even as vaccines emerge, we're vaccinating rich countries and letting the pandemic roar on for a while in poor countries. And the effect of that will inevitably be to cook up a whole new bunch of strains and variations that threaten everybody going forward. In climate change, obviously, they don't call it global warming for nothing, and you can't solve it unless you can solve it everywhere. And in this case, the rich world owes a large carbon debt to the poor world because it used up most of the available space in the atmosphere. And so there's a great need for solidarity on that count. And there's also a great need for solidarity in dealing with the effects of climate change that we can no longer prevent. The UN estimates that we could see a flood of refugees as high as 1 billion people in the course of this century as climate change kicks in. And clearly the tactics that governments have at the moment for dealing with floods of refugees are highly ineffective because there's no underlying ethic of solidarity that allows us to think about this in the ways that we're clearly going to need to, both practically and morally going forward. So I hope that the lesson of COVID is to some degree to instill some of that idea again, that we have to get back to working together within countries and between countries to try and deal with things.
You know, when you say that, Bill, what pops into my mind is we've never needed the United Nations more, right? As one of the few truly global political institutions, people sometimes make fun of the United Nations, at least in the U.S., for its inability to follow through on some of its objectives. But on the other hand, you know, we wouldn't have the IPCC, we wouldn't have a lot of the most important bodies that are fighting against climate change and trying to understand its effects. So, you know, talk a little bit about that. Where do you see, again, I think we all agree that the movements are important to keep the pressure on politicians to change. But do you also have hope that the United Nations or other kinds of international partnerships, global cooperations, could actually play more of a role in moving the ball in the right direction?
Well, let's differentiate between sort of structures and power. You definitely need structures in order to, have the negotiations, do the work, monitor the results, move things forward. You need those structures at the national level and the global level. But those structures are only as good as the balance of power that at any given moment animates them. And so the role of movements a way to say this is that what movements do, especially on huge global problems like this, is though at any given moment they're working to stop this pipeline or divest that university or whatever, their basic goal is to change the zeitgeist, to change the sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And once the zeitgeist changes, then it's possible to have rapid action. The other pieces begin to fall into place. At which point it's very useful to have good structures in place, and the UN needs probably better structures in a lot of ways than they have at the moment. Truthfully, in a lot of ways, it's not a very well-run bureaucracy often. But it's better than nothing, and can certainly be improved with good faith and good heart. But without that change in the zeitgeist, it's pretty much just a bunch of people in Geneva and New York, issuing reports that no one reads, and so on. So I think the key is shifting the zeitgeist, and I think the zeitgeist has begun decisively to shift now on this question. I think it's remarkable to watch the early days of the Biden administration and understand that they've decided that climate is clearly an, if not the organizing principle for how they're going to be dealing with the world going forward, dealing with the American economy, dealing with international relations, dealing with a lot of things. And they've signaled that in all kinds of ways. The fact that they took the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, and made his job global climate czar, really, for the US, is indicative of the sort of gravitas that this issue now commands. It's clearly front and center, and that shift, brought about by the factors that we've been describing, may be enough to really begin to cause on the ground change to happen very rapidly. Shifts in, above all, shifts in money and investment to happen at the speed that we need them to happen.
I'm so glad you brought up the zeitgeist, a venerable European philosophical concept, and a great way to set up the last question that I'm going to ask for now. And I think then Milena, maybe we'll turn over to the feed for a little while and see what questions the audience has. But Bill, a matter of great interest to me is the role that other things we can do besides just politics in terms of changing the zeitgeist. And I'm thinking particularly of the arts and what they can contribute. There's so many artists around the world working on environment, climate, energy issues now. It's very exciting, creative space. And some of these are, I would even say a film like An Inconvenient Truth, although many people see it as a sort of a political statement or as a memoir of sorts. I think it also should be seen as a work of art that moved people in ways that perhaps, reading an article in the newspaper or in a scientific journal didn't, because it added that sense of feeling and emotion. It made these issues very present to people in a way that I think the arts is often effective doing. So I just wanted to ask whether there's, how you feel about that in general, and then whether there's particular works of art that you've encountered in your work that you feel have had this effect in helping to sort of shift how we feel about climate change and make us take it more seriously.
I think it's a very, very good point. 15 years ago or so, I wrote an essay saying, why is there no serious art about climate change? Because at that point, there really hadn't been. And contrasting it with the incredible outpouring of art around the AIDS crisis a decade earlier that I think was transformative in helping get there. And I think there were, first thing to be said is be careful what you wish for, because then every bad poet in the English speaking world emailed me their poems on climate change. But the reason I think in the end is that this is a kind of new, the arts, drama, from their beginning have largely focused on relations between human beings. That's where the action has mostly been. Wars, domestic life, on and on and on. And the physical world, because it's been relatively stable, has served as a kind of backdrop for all the really juicy action between human beings. But now the background is becoming foreground. And, most of the most interesting conflict in the world involves this, at least in part, this, what had been the canvas, before. And so it's taken a little while for artists to begin to figure out how to deal with that challenge. But they are, and you're right, there's been the emergence of a great deal of good visual art, musical art, literary art in recent years. And just of, just in this country, just truly remarkable books. Richard Powers' Overstory last year, one of the most profound and important novels of the modern era, in slightly more genre context, but just as powerful and important a writer, Stanley Robinson, finally beginning to get the notice, in the kind of larger world that he should have been getting all along with his most recent book, Ministry of the Future, which is as powerful a book about climate change as there have been, and will be of great interest to anyone. It's set mostly in Europe, and it largely involves sort of, UN-like and pan-European political formations and things as they get to work solving this problem. So I think that that's really important, and I've long held that a new metaphor is as important as a new, engine in figuring out how we get to the bottom of this. And I'm very, very glad to see more and more powerful art emerging. I do think that, and this is hard for artists, those of us who are writers or, inevitably, or artists of any kind, very caught up in our own heads, and that's good. That's where great art comes from. But there's also a responsibility to produce work that bears on the actual movements that are going on around us and that badly need focused support in the very actual and real fights that are underway at any given moment. And so I give enormous credit to artists who are figuring out how to do just that kind of work. And much of, I will say, some of the most spectacular examples are coming from indigenous artists around the world. who are deeply engaged in fights over pipelines and things like that. And I give enormous credit to them for figuring out how to be both profound and effective at the same time.
I'm so glad you shouted out Indigenous artists who are often working, with their own tradition of cultural apocalypse, having undergone sort of a massive disruption, and it's such an important touch point for thinking about disruptions, in our world too. And I just wanted to say, just tag on one thought to that, which I think was really lovely, Bill, what you said, and just say that, I've always thought that the arts have a role to play, because one of the big advantages that fossil fuels and petroculture, if I may, have is that, at least in places like the global north, we have all these positive memories associated with all the thrills and luxuries of using energy without a sense of conscience or consequences. And the arts have this ability to sort of, by thinking about futures, to give us memories of different futures. And those are futures that we don't want to have in the more dystopian scenarios, but also memories of futures we might want to aspire to. It makes it harder for the fossil fuel overlords to tell us that the future will be terrible, and if we become more environmentalist, if we actually have models, right?
Beautifully put, very beautifully put. Yeah.
So with that, Milena, how are things looking in the feed? Do we have questions we'd like to bring in from the audience?
Yes. Thank you, first of all, to the two of you. I think that was a really inspiring discussion with many new thoughts, I think, to consider. So we do have some questions, not too many yet. So if people are still thinking about their questions, do please put them into the Q&A box. And I think we can just start at the top, really. Maybe we can take the first two together, actually, because they are questions about sort of government action, and in what sort of economic areas government action should happen. So you talked obviously about the fossil fuel industry, but here the first question is about, what about the increasing reliance on burning forest-derived biomass in the UK and the EU, which also obviously increases CO2 in the air, even
That's
though
that's
supposed
a
to be
very
carbon neutral.
good,
Yeah.
very good question, Milena. And I've been actually writing about it for a long time. And most recently, 2 weeks ago in the New Yorker, had a piece that tried to take on just this question. This is a really stupid idea. The UK has the biggest of these biomass burning plants, the Drax plant, which sounds as bad as it is. But they also are burning a fair amount of this stuff in Denmark and someplace, other parts of the Low Countries there, I think. And they're cutting down some forests in Estonia and the Balkans, but Europe doesn't have enough forests left to cut down to, to scale. So most of the biomass is coming on boats from the southeastern United States, where they're chopping down forests and turning them into pellets, with all the usual consequences in terms of environmental racism and things along the way, the communities that it comes from. The climate problem is that, though theoretically, when you cut down a tree, another one will grow in its place to soak up the carbon, the theoretically part takes 50, 60, 70 years to happen, whereas the plume of carbon goes into the atmosphere immediately. And we're breaking the back of the climate system in the next 10 or 20 years. It's not going to make any difference what happens 60 years out. So the science has shifted decisively on this, and it's a very the piece I wrote for the New Yorker had the headline like, if you're serious about climate change, stop burning things. Stop burning coal, stop burning natural gas, stop burning oil, stop burning wood, stop lighting things on fire. We're extremely blessed by the fact that there is a very large fire blazing 93 million miles away, and we have now the technology to take full advantage of the light that it sheds on photovoltaic panels, of the differentials in pressure that result in the winds that can be harnessed by turbines, so on and so forth. let the burning happen at a good, safe distance, and stop doing it here. And I'm really grateful for the campaigners, especially in the UK, who are working hard on trying some. The basic problem here is that the EU continues to have a directive describing the biomass burning as carbon neutral, when by any scientific assessment at this point, that's nonsense. And so it's silly to pretend otherwise, and just time to get to work. It's always amazing how difficult it is to remind rule makers that that the that physics and chemistry can't be nudged and cajoled to operate in ways that are more pleasing to, would make it easier to make progress, but they can't. So we shouldn't keep trying.
Thank you. I think that was a very clear answer, and it links to loads of issues around biofuels as well, and air pollution and so on as well. So thank you for that one. The next question is actually also an interesting question, because I think it really relates to this tension between, we need a shift in demand, a shift in behavior. So for example, travel, flying and so on, which is quite a lot in the discussion. But of course, there are people dependent on the tourism industry in some countries, in many countries, in fact. So what are your thoughts on that, sort of around tourism? What role should that play in terms of tackling climate change?
Well, Dominic can talk here too, because of course he's in another one of these communities where the economic transition is going to come with costs for people whose livelihoods are embroiled in the current way of doing things. And there's no doubt that we need a kind of what everyone now, the term of art is a just transition, that takes account of the fact that it's not people's fault that they grew up mining coal, or, serving drinks to Westerners arriving on their beaches, or whatever it is. And simply the fact that we can't afford to keep doing those things in the same way shouldn't mean a life of penury for those who perform those jobs at the moment. Tourism is difficult. My guess is that tourism may be one of those things where where COVID actually changes a little bit some of the ways we think about the world. One hope is perhaps that, and this is something to go back to what Dominic was saying earlier about art and fiction. This is one of the things that Kim Stanley Robinson explores so well in Ministry of the Future and his other novels, is the idea that we might fundamentally shift some of the ways that we behave, so that our emphasis when we're traveling places is not on speed anymore. And that might produce very different forms of tourism that were A, more interesting, and B, less damaging to the world around us. But it is very clear that it no longer is sensible to constantly jump on airplanes simply because you want to be someplace that's a little warmer than the place you are now. That form of tourism, which accounts for an enormous amount of tourism, it doesn't strike me as okay anymore.
I'd agree, Bill, and I just wanted to tag on to this, because this reminds me of one of my favorite remarks that my friend, the Icelandic filmmaker Benedikt Erlingsson, who has a terrific film called Woman at War, which is a great climate change film if you haven't checked it out. But one of the things he likes to say is this idea of a new ethos of slow travel should be seen as a feature, not a bug of this transition. He said, think of what we're selling, where you say you get to go someplace and stay there for a longer period of time. You'll be less stressed out. If you travel, just make sure you travel and stay in a place and get to know it. And I think you're right. The pandemic has really shown us how much of the travel we do is inessential, but maybe it makes us more appreciate the essential travel, both for business, but also just for sort of psychic health that we do and recovery from our stressful lives. This slowing down of the economy that's happened under the pandemic is something that I think could transition very nicely to what you're describing.
And it's also made it clear that um, that as long as you're actually able to connect to the internet, you're, you know, in connection with the rest. I mean, you don't actually need to get to Paris in 6 hours in order to do whatever business it is you're doing. You know, uh, um, um, uh, one can envision a future not that far off where the kind of new work, say, on modern sailing ships that are really interesting, allow you to take a nice voyage courtesy of the wind. Uh, and since you're connected through your laptop all the time anyway, what do you really care? I mean, you can do the same work. There's virtually nothing that we do that requires us actually to be there with each other, at some level anymore anyway.
That's a really good point, and I think it really connects to another question here by Evan Exelson about the role of art actually in making us or enabling us to experience or share the experiences of others without maybe us having to travel. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this goes back to what we were saying before. Look, travel is really important. It's really important that people get to see. The problem with travel at the moment is, as I said, that it's mostly designed to allow you to replicate as perfectly as possible the life you're already leading, just someplace warmer. Okay, and that doesn't strike me as interesting, necessary, useful. But when we do travel in the future, and I say this to young people often, we're going off from college for a study abroad or whatever. It's like, go someplace that's actually really different and try to bring home some lessons from there that are going to inform your own life and the lives of your community. And that's, that strikes me as powerful. And of course, art is one of the ways of doing that travel that doesn't require you to move anywhere at all. So yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you. And there's another really interesting question here by Bob Johnson, which, if I understand it rightly, sort of asks this question about how can we explain the mechanism of climate change and the physical mechanism of it to people in a way that they can almost sort of experience it, because it often still feels like a really distant thing that happens. It obviously already affects many people across the globe, but in some areas it doesn't maybe yet show effects on people's lives directly. So yeah, what is the sort of the elevator speech that one can give to people to make climate change a reality for them, I suppose?
Well, this was the great problem, having written the first book for a general audience about climate change, I can tell you that this was the great problem 30 some years ago. But it's less of a problem with each passing year, because Mother Nature is now demonstrating on an hourly basis the folly of, so, at this point, like last year, if it hadn't been the year of the pandemic, would have been the year of the conflagration. There's nobody with a brain left in Australia who doubts the changes that are underway. Ditto for California and the West Coast of the United States. We're talking about very large swaths of the world now that experience these things on a increasingly regular basis. Houston, where Dominic is, the absolute center of the hydrocarbon industry, had Hurricane Harvey 3 years ago, the largest rainstorm by far in the history of the United States. 5 feet of rain fell on parts of Houston. Not enough to convince everybody there, that I suppose, but definitely. I remember the headline on Business Week magazine the week after Hurricane Sandy a decade ago shut down power to all of New York. The headline across the front page, there nothing but words on the cover of Business Week, and it just said, "It's global warming, stupid." You know, so I think that this becomes less of a problem. I do think there remains a problem in that the people who get hit first and worst by climate change are the people who did the least to cause it, the poorest and most vulnerable. It's the highest form of injustice that there really is. And those people are fully engaged in the fight. I mean, when you do polling in the US, Latino Americans and African Americans are by far the people most concerned about climate change and eager to take action. And it's a little slower to impact people whose wealth provides them with some insulation from change, but even that's beginning to break down fairly fast.
Great, thank you. And it's actually, that was a question that came up in the chat as well, in terms of how can we involve, Black communities or ethnic minority communities in this debate. And so, yeah, thank you for picking this up.
They're well involved. The problem, at least in the United States, is not it's white people. That too keeps voting for idiots who won't do anything about this, and so on and so forth. If the U.S. was an entirely Black and brown country, we'd be taking all kinds of action on climate change. And I'm really glad to see that the Biden administration has made climate justice and environmental justice a central focus of the first couple of weeks of their administration, talking about it in very explicit terms over and over and over again.
I'm really glad that the justice topic plays such a prominent role in this debate, because it is absolutely key to it all, isn't it? Because we do need to get people on board as well, and many climate policies have these regressive effects, for example, in financial terms on vulnerable communities as well. So that makes people obviously not very much in favor of some of the climate policies, including carbon taxes and so on. I guess one interesting question that I'd like to throw into the debate is where you stand on the dilemma between, on the one hand, we need technological development, but on the other hand, which often relates to economic growth, but on the other hand, there's lots of evidence that economic growth is driving emissions. So where do you sit in this sort of conflict between technological development and economic growth?
Well, I've written a lot about economic growth, and I think there's a very strong argument to be made, even absent climate change, that our focus on it is wrong-headed, and that it no longer generates reliably increases in human happiness. It's especially true in worlds where all economic growth gets funneled to like 12 guys who own everything. And who are all busy building rocket ships so they can go to Mars anyway, which the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. But this is what I was referring to earlier. Some of the questions about economic growth are, in abeyance a little bit, because the rapid fall in the price of renewable energy seems to indicate that we can do some of what we're doing now anyway, much more cleanly. And there's going to need to be, if we're going to take advantage of that, a real boom in the construction of it. I mean, if one was looking for rational source of economic growth going forward, it would clearly be in this transition to clean energy, which is a big project.
Absolutely, yes. Great, thank you. Dominic, do you have any other questions that you'd like to pick up from the chat? Also wanted to give you a chance here to throw some in.
Oh, I just on the subject of Escape to Mars, Elon Musk, the rest of it. I just wanted to say that again. This is to plug your most recent book, Bill, Falter. But in the epilogue to the book, you talk about, the need to recommit to this unbearably beautiful planet. And I love the way you put it. You said, the least hospitable part of the world, right? The tip of Mount Everest or the middle of the Sahara Desert is so much more hospitable than the most hospitable part of Mars. Why are we focusing so much on this fantasy of escape? Well, because it allows us to not have to examine what we've been doing that is causing our environment to deteriorate so that we have to escape the disposable planet, right?
Yes,
And I think it's so
also
important to refocus on the planet we have.
And it's the deepest of libertarian fantasies. The idea that you can go someplace where nobody could make you pay taxes is, the deepest fantasy of the, libertarian class that runs Silicon Valley at this point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Brilliant. There's maybe one last question which also relates to the other question about growth here by Nessa Winston about what do you think about the proposal to have a 4-day working week, which could also slow down our lives, slow down consumption. So yeah, proposals by the New Economics Foundation, for example, or Ian Goff around that.
Well, I think this goes right to what the very good case that Dominic's been making throughout all this conversation. That one of the things we're talking about here is, in these questions at some level, are as artistic as they are economic, are just questions about, what we want out of the world. And so, I mean, it strikes me as obvious that a 4-day work week would be a human choice to be making, and it would require that we share the wealth that we have enough to make it possible for people to do that. I mean, at the moment, it's too many Americans who are working, in essence, 9-day work weeks because they got 2 jobs, to try and make ends meet. And I mean, I'm a Vermonter, so I stand with Bernie Sanders and what's essentially a kind of Northern European approach to a state that allows people to try and live decent lives. And we're very grateful for some of those examples and understand that they are flawed and problematic too, like everything else in the world is flawed and problematic. But I have a feeling that that may be the single most important source going forward of important collaboration across the Atlantic, is figuring out how to somehow build down some of the manic American commitment to more and bigger at all times.
Brilliant. Wow, I think this last answer really drew together all different strands from this debate about international collaboration, changes in lifestyles and demands, political action, and the zeitgeist. So thank you again so much, Bill, and also Dominic, for your questions. Yeah, Julia, do you want to say something to close the seminar?
Yes, thank you, Milena. So thank you again very much to Milena for chairing, and to Bill and Dominic for an excellent discussion. And thank you to all the participants today for the excellent questions. We're sorry that we weren't able to answer so many of the questions because it was such a rich discussion. Thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to revisit this will be posted online on our YouTube channel. And do keep tuned to further webinars in the CES Insight series. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care, y'all.
Take care.
Thank you.